Hey everyone, and welcome to today's podcast episode where we'll be talking about a commodity that plays a big part in shaping our world lithium. I'm Karen.
I'm Avea.
I'm Jacqueline.
And I'm Rihanna. So before researching our commodity, we didn't know much about lithium, but we've come to learn that it actually plays a huge role in our everyday lives.
Honestly, the only part of lithium that I was familiar with before researching more was in the aspect of chemistry.
Same with Karen. I first learned about it through chemistry, but I also heard of lithium being used in batteries, but that's about it.
I have to agree with everyone here. I'm not quite as familiar with lithium, but I do know that it is part of the periodic table. Interestingly, lithium has transitioned from being a niche material in medicine and ceramics to something much bigger. It is a critical element in modern technology today, tied deeply to global trade and finance. It powers everything from electric cars to clean energy and smartphones, but its supply chain is anything but simple.
So it turns out that there's a lot more to lithium than what we already know. I think when people hear the word lithium, they might commonly think about lithium as an element or in batteries. Like Avea had mentioned before, they're found in electric cars, in smartphones, and other devices. But aside from that, we'll also talk about the global impact of lithium and why it's such an important material.
We'll also be covering how lithium became so essential, where it comes from, what it means socially and financially, and the sustainability challenges that come along with it. Okay, so let's take it back to the very beginning. Where did the use of lithium even originate from, and what's the story behind it?
That's a really good question. So, in doing my research, I found that lithium was actually discovered all the way back in 1817 by a Swedish chemist named Johann August Arfvedson. He found it while analyzing this mineral called petalite, but honestly, at that point, no one really thought that it was that special. It was kind of just there.
Yeah, for sure. It didn't exactly take the world by storm at first. It was mostly used in things like glass, ceramics, and medicine. While, fun fact, lithium salts were and still are used to treat bipolar disorder.
Exactly, it's a really interesting material, but then the 20th century came and that was kind of the turning point for lithium, because that's when Akira Yoshino, a Japanese chemist and engineer, developed the first lithium-ion battery. And that kind of changed everything, because suddenly with lithium-ion batteries, we had this lightweight rechargeable battery that could power all sorts of electronics.
And that was a really huge discovery because it meant that we could make smaller, more efficient tech like cell phones and laptops, and that we didn't need to be plugged in all the time. It was a major game changer.
Exactly, and over time, lithium-ion batteries also evolved and really scaled up, making their way into electric vehicles and even renewable energy storage. So it really went from something super niche to something we really can't live without.
And now it's basically everywhere. Our smartphones, our laptops, and even backup power systems for our homes and hospitals. It's wild to think that a mineral, once sitting quietly in rocks, is now powering entire cities.
And that's the reason why people sometimes call lithium white gold. Not because it's literally gold, but because it's become so valuable in the push for greener technology and a low-carbon future. So that was a great introduction to the commodity of lithium. I can't wait for us to uncover so much more to this commodity.
Yeah, me too. So where does lithium even come from? Like, where is it extracted, processed, used? I know that the largest reserves are found in a place referred to as the Lithium Triangle of South America. This triangle, so to speak, includes Chile, Argentina, and Bolivia. And these countries have huge salt flats rich in lithium brine.
Yeah, lithium extraction process is probably one of the most important aspects of this supply chain. There are two primary ways lithium is extracted: brine extraction and hard rock mining. In South America's Lithium Triangle, so that includes Chile, Argentina, and Bolivia, lithium is found in brine deposits beneath vast salt flats. The process works like this. Underground brine is pumped to the surface and spread across massive evaporation ponds.
And with this extraction process, sunlight and wind play a very important role in the production of lithium. So sunlight and wind gradually evaporate the water, which leaves behind a concentrated lithium-rich brine. The brine is processed with chemicals to separate lithium carbonate or lithium hydroxide, which are key ingredients for batteries. And interestingly enough, Australia is actually currently the world's largest lithium producer, and the way lithium is extracted in Australia is through hard rock mining, which requires a lot more energy but less water than brine.
And then comes the processing stage. Even though China doesn't have the largest reserves, it dominates refining and battery manufacturing. So lithium mining in South America or Australia often end up being processed in China before becoming part of the products used globally.
Yeah, this whole supply chain is really complex and interdependent, and as Schuster discusses in Forecasts, the value of resources like lithium is very deeply tied to global finance, market predictions, and even environmental uncertainties. In many ways, lithium isn't just a mineral, it's a bet on the future. Let's take a second to zoom out a little bit. I'm curious if any of you guys think that lithium holds any kind of social meaning, like beyond its use in tech. Does it represent something more, maybe even to any of you guys personally?
Yeah, totally. I think for a lot of people, us included, lithium kind of represents progress. It's tied to this vision of a cleaner, more sustainable future. Like, it's hard to imagine moving away from fossil fuels without it. The idea that we can store renewable energy efficiently, that's a pretty big deal. And especially with climate change being such a pressing issue, it feels like lithium is one of the tools we're counting on to move forward.
No, yeah, I agree with Avea, but at the same time, while it's like an improvement to the industry, we can't really ignore the impact that lithium mining has on people and the environment, especially in places like the Atacama Desert in northern Chile. That region is incredibly dry already, and lithium extraction uses so much water. And it's been linked to water scarcity that's affecting indigenous communities and local farmers who heavily depend on the water to keep up with their land. So while it's seen as a solution globally, it can actually create serious problems locally.
Yeah, I agree. And I also think that there's a financial layer to all this. Lithium isn't just valuable because of what it does, but it also has become a very strategic resource. Countries and corporations are competing to lock in supply chains. Prices are super volatile. One minute lithium will be booming, the next minute the prices will drop. And that creates this whole atmosphere of speculation. So it's kind of like a modern day resource race.
Right, exactly. I feel like lithium represents this tension. Like, on one hand, it's innovative and exciting, it helps us build a greener future, but on the other hand, it brings up tough questions about equity, exploitation, and who really benefits, like the topics we've been discussing in class too. So for us, it's more than just something that powers our phones or electric cars. It's the symbol of both hope and challenge at the same time. Alright, so we've talked about where lithium comes from and how important it is, but let's get into the bigger picture. What about sustainability? What do you guys think we need to consider when looking at lithium's future for our planet?
So yeah, that's a really important point to bring up. I mean, like, on one hand, lithium is essential for green energy because it powers our electric vehicles, the solar storage systems, and all of that. But the irony is that the process of extracting lithium isn't exactly green or environmentally friendly, because in some ways it's actually creating a new kind of environmental strain.
Exactly, that's actually a great point. One of the biggest issues is the water, especially in South America and places like the Atacama Desert. Mining uses a ton of groundwater, which is already super limited in those regions. And it's actually having an effect on local ecosystems and communities that depend on that water just to live and farm.
Exactly. And while Australia's hard rock mining doesn't rely on brine or evaporation, it's still super energy intensive. So it's kind of like a trade-off. You'll have less water usage, but there'll be higher carbon emissions.
But the good news is that we're not entirely stuck with just these methods forever. There's a lot of research going into direct lithium extraction, which could be faster and more water efficient.
Yeah, and that ties into another huge solution, recycling. Right now, we're not doing nearly enough of it, and tons of lithium ends up in landfills when old batteries are thrown out, which is such a waste considering how valuable it is.
Yeah, and if we could recover more lithium from used batteries, we'd be able to reduce the need for mining altogether, and that would actually be a pretty big step towards closing the loop and creating a circular battery economy.
There's also exciting stuff happening in battery alternatives, like sodium-ion technology. It's still early days, but if those batteries become viable, we could reduce our dependence on lithium altogether.
So yeah, while lithium is super important right now, its future depends on how responsibly we manage it, from how we extract it to how we reuse it. It's not just about having the right tools, but using them really wisely. Alright, so before we wrap up, I think it's really worth connecting what we've been talking about to one of the readings we did for this project, Caroline Schuster's Forecasts. That piece honestly gave me a totally different way of thinking about commodities like lithium, because up until now we've mostly been talking about lithium as a physical thing, something that you can mine, process, and build into a battery.
What Schuster really highlights is that commodities are also financial tools. They're not just materials. We invest in them, we speculate on their value, and we build futures around what we think they're going to be. And that applies to lithium in such a huge way. It's not just sitting in the ground waiting to be used. There are entire industries, economies, and even government policies that are making decisions based on forecasts about what lithium might become.
Oh, and I also thought that was such an interesting point. The idea that lithium, like the weather in her case study, is deeply tied to risk prediction and uncertainty. Just like farmers in Paraguay were dealing with crop insurance based on future weather conditions, lithium investors and governments are making big decisions based on projected demand, possible shortages, and future technological breakthroughs. So in both cases, it's really less about what's happening right now, this moment, and more about shaping actions around imagined and predicted futures.
Yeah, I actually think it's a really good point to bring out the part about the future, just because obviously, like as we've seen in studying climate change, it's been affecting our future. A part of the reading that really stood out to me was how she described forecasts as more than just numbers, almost as if they represented something like a narrative. They shape how people act. They shape how investors behave and even how governments plan out their own futures. I feel like the use of lithium can also draw parallels from the fact that it's a natural resource that's being extracted from local communities and all of the effects that come along with that.
Yeah, and lithium isn't just a material in the ground, it's also kind of a symbol of where we think the world is going. Everyone's betting on an electrical and clean future, and because of that, the value of lithium keeps fluctuating based on what people expect in 5, 10, or even 20 years. And just to add, in my opinion, this kind of mirrors how the finance and agricultural companies in the story forecast try to provide solutions to local farmers, but sometimes it may not work because of the process and the way that they're doing these things, because it could favor their solution rather than the farmers, because these companies only rely on speculation and weather index, which isn't really a reliable method to keep up with the health and value of the farmers' crops.
Exactly, Jacqueline. And the way that Schuster talks about finance and climate and forecasts, it's like lithium is part of this broader financial ecosystem that is driven by uncertainty. We don't actually know what technologies will dominate in the future. Will lithium still be the go-to battery material in a decade? Maybe, maybe not. But companies are investing in it, like it definitely will be.
It's kind of like we're trying to solve the climate crisis with tools we're still experimenting with, and lithium becomes this placeholder for hope, but also risk. Just like in the reading, forecasts don't just reflect the future, they create it.
Yeah, for sure. And it can also connect back to what I said previously about how lithium markets are super volatile. 1 minute prices are at an all-time high, and then the next they'll crash out because the demand slows down or a new battery technology is shown. It's kind of like betting on the weather, except instead of betting on rain, you're betting on battery chemistry.
Yeah, and that's such a good point. And we're seeing that kind of forecasting mindset show up at the government level too. Countries aren't just reacting to current demand for lithium, they're also making big moves based on where they think the market is going. So it's less about how much lithium we need right now and more about who can control the supply chain in the future. That's why we're seeing international competition heat up, because everyone's trying to secure mining rights, fund exploration projects, and build battery factories. And because they're betting on lithium being even more critical. And that also reminds me of a part in Schuster's forecast where she talks about how financial instruments like agricultural insurance aren't just based on what has happened, but on what might happen. For example, in Paraguay, she describes how farmers were making planting decisions based on weather forecasts and insurance models created by people far away from the fields. And obviously those models, they shaped real material choices, even when the actual weather didn't match up with the pattern of crop growth.
Yeah, and I think the same thing's happening with lithium. Those forecasts about future electric vehicle growth or energy storage demand are shaping national policy, investment strategies, and even military planning. It's not just about lithium as a material and a commodity, it's about lithium as a story. One that countries are using to prepare for a future they're not even sure will happen.
And that can get really complicated, especially for communities actually living near extraction sites. Their lives are being impacted by decisions that are based on speculation and long-term projections. Like, someone in New York or Beijing might be predicting that lithium will be huge in 2040, and that ends up driving water use in the Atacama Desert today.
Exactly. It's not just about whether lithium is profitable now, it's about the story people are telling about what it might become. And like Schuster points out, these forecasts can really influence policy, markets, and everyday life, especially in vulnerable regions.
And that brings up the ethical side of it too. Is it fair to base massive environmental decisions on something so uncertain? I get that we have to plan for the future and all, but there's a difference between planning and speculating, and sometimes the lines can get very blurred.
Yeah, right, exactly. And it's not just the financial risk, we have to remember the climate risk, the social risk, and also the ecological risk. The people forecasting lithium demand aren't the ones dealing with water shortages or habitat loss. It affects mostly the local communities and whoever is living in that region.
And that's the thing. When we see lithium as this green solution, we forget how entangled it is in these bigger systems of finance and uncertainty. I don't think it would be an assumption to say that lithium extraction is driven by profit motives. This process can often lead to the exploitation of workers and environmental degradation. A parallel we see with forecasts is where farmers are left vulnerable to the consequences of unreliable insurance coverage as it relates back to forecasts.
So maybe the lesson from forecasts is that we can't just look at commodities like lithium as materials. I think we need to look at the future they're tied to, who's imagining that future and who's being left out of it.
That's honestly such a good way to frame it, because if we only listen to investors or tech companies, we're missing a huge part of the picture, especially the voices of indigenous communities, small farmers, or people living near mines. We must also prioritize those involved in areas of extraction before the ethical issues outweigh the benefits that lithium offers.
Yeah, and we have to keep an open mind, because we also risk of locking ourselves into one way of thinking. If we're too focused on lithium as the answer, we might ignore or underfund other technology like battery alternatives or more sustainable solutions.
It is almost like a paradox. Lithium is supposed to help reduce climate risk, but the way we're handling it, financially, politically, even environmentally, might just be creating new risks. And that's what I loved about the reading. It really helped put words to that tension.
Same here. It really made me realize how closely tied climate action is to finance and storytelling. And it made me think more critically about how we talk about lithium, not just as a solution, but as a symbol of where we're going and how uncertain that path really is.
Okay, so to sum up this entire thing, lithium plays a massive role in the shift towards cleaner energy. It's powering a lot of the technology that we need to move away from fossil fuels, but it also comes with a lot of big environmental, economic, and ethical challenges that we can't afford to ignore either.
Yeah, and I think it's a really important reminder that even so-called green solutions aren't automatically perfect, because sustainability isn't just about what materials we use, but rather how we source them and who it impacts and how we manage their life cycle.
Exactly. And as consumers and as future decision makers, it's up to us to be thoughtful about these things. The materials behind our tech, our energy, and our lifestyle, they all have human and environmental stories attached to them.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for tuning into our podcast. We hope this episode really got you thinking a little differently about the everyday materials shaping our world, especially lithium. Be sure to catch us next time for another deep dive into the global economy, one commodity at a time.